The PowerPoint this evening is going to be on approaching primary sources, but before that, I wanted to go over what your assignments for this week are. Right before the webinar started, a few of you said that you just wanted to make sure you understood what you were supposed to do this week. So under week 4, so theme 2, week 4, you have 2 different activities or assignments. One is continuing on the discussion forum that you had started in theme 3. And so now you're just in theme 3, we asked you to discuss another secondary source. And now in theme 4, we're asking you to respond to a classmate, compare your secondary sources, and draw some conclusions from there. What we're also asking you to do is to revisit your research questions and to develop a research plan preparation. And this is partially where my PowerPoint on the primary sources is going to come into. But so part one for the research plan was when you did the topic exploration worksheet, we asked you to come up with some research questions. Now, looking back, we just want you to go back over your research questions and basically see if you want to keep them. You might have decided now, looking back, that your research question is just too big. It would require like 20 books to answer that question you chose. Or maybe it's too small and you could answer it in 1 paragraph. Perhaps you came up with this research question because you were really interested in it, but the more you've looked into the research kit, the more you realize that the primary and secondary sources available to you don't really answer that question you have. And I actually had that happen to a student last semester, that they were really interested in a specific topic, and I can't really remember what it was. I want to say they were interested in something to do with Eleanor Roosevelt and the atomic bomb or World War II, but none of our sources dealt with that question. And the student ended up writing, I think, more on Truman and his reaction and thoughts about the atomic bomb. So what you want to do is consider all those questions. Was my research question too big? Was it too small? Can I answer it with the sources that are available to me? Because that's what you want to focus on. I mean, obviously, we all want to write on what interests us the most, and we want to research what interests us the most. But we also, as historians, have to think of, what do I have evidence for? And we've given you the evidence. We've given you the primary sources and the secondary sources. So that's the evidence that you want to use for these assignments. Well, what can your evidence tell you? So we want you to go back over those research questions from the topic exploration worksheet and just see, now that you've delved much more deeply into your topic, do they still work for you? Are they still what you want to use? And if they are, okay, that's fine. If not, though, now is the time to revise. Now is the time to step back and say, you know what? It would actually be better if I focus solely on what rationale politically did the United States government use to drop the atomic bomb, as opposed to what were the many reasons the atomic bomb was dropped, which that again could be like a 20-book summary, whereas just the political reasons or what were Truman's decisions, that's going to help you focus a little more narrowly. Once you have narrowed your research question, and remember that the answer to your research question is going to be your thesis statement. So think of it that way. Think of a question that you can answer with a very strong sentence. Next, you have already analyzed a few secondary sources by this point, right? The works of historians on the topic. So now we want you to go into the primary sources, the actual evidence used by the historians within those secondary sources. And that's what we're going to be reviewing tonight, how to approach a primary source. Okay, so let me move that out of the way. Are we only allowed to use the research kit? Yes, we are only going to use the research kit for right now, because since this is a 100 level class, we give you the evidence because we're working on analysis. You're going to see that in the 100 class, 114, and I believe 113, that we give the sources, because in these classes we want students to work on analysis. It's going to be in later classes that we're going to ask you to find your own sources in higher level classes. But right now, we're just working on historical thinking skills and historical analysis. So yes. No, that's a really good question. I'm really glad you asked, because actually I literally just about 20 minutes ago answered that same question in the general question form within my own classroom. So this question comes up a lot. I'm pretty sure I was emailed that question over the weekend. So I apparently need to make it more clear right from the beginning. But yes, we are only using sources from the research kit. All right. So how do we approach primary sources? So primary sources are your evidence, right? Your material from the time period. So for this week in 421, we're asking you to dive deeper into the primary sources in your research kit. And we're asking you to select primary sources from the same topic as your research interest. When you do this, here are the questions you're going to ask. And you can even, for a long time, I had students just kind of write this along the side. You don't need to write a lot. I'm going to actually show you in a way how little you can write, but it's just an idea to get you used to what you should be thinking every time you approach a primary source. So first, who's the author? What's their background? That one seems pretty straightforward. Audience. To whom is the author writing? Or who is that source intended for? Is it intended for anyone? I mean, if we're doing like ancient history, it could just, a necklace, for example, could be a primary source. But so if we're talking with a written document, who is it intended for? Or if it's a painting, who is it intended for? Content or subject, what is the author writing about? Bias. And for those who listened last week to my secondary source, for everyone who has ever been a student in any of my classes, this is, to me, the biggest question of analysis. So you need to think to yourself, what is the author's bias? Like I said last week, what is the author trying to sell me? For this question, though, also, especially in a primary source, I find it very helpful to think, what is the author not telling me? What else do I know that is happening at the time that the author has completely left out? And finally, since you're using this as a primary source, as a historian, how would you use it? Would you be able to, is this a tax record that you could use economically? Is this a piece of legislation that you could use in a political history? Is this a journal by a farmer that you could use in a social history? That's what you want to ask yourself. What type of history is this source giving me? Okay, so I said let's investigate further. This picture is rather small, but I did a screenshot of the first primary source available in your research kit under science. And that's for the Associated Press articles. The AP was there, US drops atomic bombs on Japan in 1945. So this is just the citation, literally from the research kit under science. And I thought we would just go over it, and I'm going to show you how, in a way, simple it can be to approach a primary source as a historian. So the author of that source is actually, we don't know the person's name, but we do know they are a journalist. And this is important because what is the job of a journalist? Well, I mean, one would say to, give us the news, but another is also to sell the news, right? So they need to make us want to buy their information, pay attention to their information. For this article, they're actually writing from Washington. They are literally writing from like a press conference held by President Truman. So right there, they're a Washington journalist attending the press conference by President Truman. Who is their audience? Their audience is the general American public. So they are writing most likely for people who support the American war effort based on things that the American president is saying. Right there, we are already getting so many ideas on what this source is telling us. Well, it's from the point of view of the American president. Is it political? It's writing to the American people about the war effort. Does that make it social? Well, let's keep going and let's keep discussing. Subject and bias. So the subject is the dropping of the atomic bomb, according to the United States president, and the impact it has on Japan. The bias is, again, this point of view is that the information is coming to us through the White House and President Truman. This is the official White House story of what is happening or what has happened in Japan, in Hiroshima. So we need to think throughout this entire time that this story is given to us through the president. So even though we already now have to consider the bias of the newspaper man, we have to consider the bias of the president. This is a political story. He is trying to sell the American public on why it was necessary to drop the bomb and on how it makes us look on the world stage. And that's what we need to be thinking as we're reading this primary source. The primary source, by the way, if you've read it, it's not very long. It doesn't say any of these things. We need to be aware that it says these things. So how would I use this source as evidence? This brings in the whole question of the historical lens. Does this answer a political lens, a military lens, a scientific lens? It actually, for me, could be used for all three, even technically, socially. But politically, again, it's coming through the White House. Militarily, it's stating that this is necessary to stop the war and to show our power to other areas. And scientifically, the impact and why we had to spend this amount of money and how it has been secretly built this entire time. All of that speaks to multiple different layers. And again, if you read this article, it is relatively short, but it provides so much information for so much evidence for so many different types of historical lenses that you will actually see this article in many secondary sources because so many authors can use it for so many different arguments. Remember, the information is from President Truman, and it describes the dropping of the bomb from the position of the American government. So it's going to fill in all of these areas for us. So what now? What do we need you to do now? Well, these are very simple questions. As you can see, they didn't even take me too long to review. But there are 5 questions, and you want to review these questions with each of your primary sources. Now, if you do have an author, you can Google that author and try to see if you can find out more about him or her. You also want to think at all times, with this and with secondary sources, what is the author trying to make me believe? Next, and this is important for your research plan preparation, but ask yourself if the primary sources confirm the arguments of your secondary sources. Why or why not? Sometimes you will read a secondary source, and it will say, X happened because of this. And then you will go and read a primary source, and it will say X happened for a completely different reason. But that's because the secondary source is using multiple primary sources. The question is the secondary source not aware of the primary source that disagrees with it? Or is it ignoring the primary source that disagrees with it? And that's a judgment call you have to make. And that's a judgment call we can use at any point in our life. What is this scholar trying to tell me? And do I trust them to include all of the information or to be aware of all of the information? And if it's a no to either of those, you really need to step back and think about using that source. Now, the sources in our research kit, we as historians have vetted them. So I wouldn't be too concerned, but that's more for your real life, that as we go around, as you move into higher level history classes, ask yourself, is there something missing that you know about? And why is it missing? Why wouldn't the author talk about it? And finally, and this is important for, again, your research plan, and also as we move forward towards your other projects, but what information do these primary sources add to your understanding? Do they give you a human dimension? Do you give you that real-time moment of what we knew and when? And I always find that very interesting, because obviously we are looking back with hindsight 2020. And so we think to ourselves, I completely understand what is happening. I have no questions here. But back then, what did they know? And we've seen that even today, that when a news story breaks, it can change every 20 minutes. Well, it's very similar to back then. So we might read something and say, well, that's completely wrong. Why would someone publish that? Well, because that's what they knew and when they knew it. So we need to think about things like that as we watch the real-time development. So that is how you approach a primary source. And as we move into primary sources this week, that's what you want to think of each time you look over them. Just who is the author? Who is the audience? How does that shape what they're saying? What is the content? What is the bias? And how would you use that source as evidence? What lens are you using to look at that source? Okay, I think that covers what I wanted to say about primary sources and for this week's assignments. Does anyone have any more questions? Your research plan shouldn't be too complicated. I know a couple of you are worried that you're overthinking it. We basically just want to make sure that your questions can be answered with the sources we have given you, and that you are moving on to developing the rest of your project. Is there a format? For this week's, let me double check right this second before I tell you that I don't think there is. So there is, let's see, there does not seem to be a direct format. Nope, and on the rubric, I am not seeing a direct format. So my suggestion would be to have a part one where you give your new revised research questions and you explain why you have revised them in such a way. Make sure you explain that. I have noticed that in the past, every now and then I'll get a student who gives me the revised research question, but that does not explain their thinking that went into the revision. And so that's not going to earn you full credit because I need to see both of that. So I would include a part one where you give your new research questions and your explanation. And it doesn't have to be a lot, maybe like 2 sentences per research question on why you revised it in that manner. And then second, you're going to go into your primary and secondary sources. And so you're just going to answer the question. So for that one, you want to tell us what primary sources you looked at. You're going to tell us what, so the primary sources from your topic exploration worksheet, make sure you restate that. That's another thing. A lot of students will just assume that I remember the primary sources that you used from that, and I don't. And while I can go back and find it, it makes it a lot easier for all of us if I can just, look at it right there. So for part two, you want to explain what the primary sources add to your understanding of your selected topic, how they relate to the secondary sources. So what did they tell you? How are they related to the secondary sources? Did the secondary sources use them? Are they on the same topic? What's the historical context of the historical event based on what you read in your secondary sources? So what is the historical context? What else is happening when they drop the bomb on Hiroshima? And then you're going to want to answer those questions. What was going on in the world? What were some of the biggest themes or trends? And how did they impact your topic? And all of those, and you can even write those as paragraphs. Sorry, I just want to make sure I covered all of that. So you can write them as paragraphs, and that's what you're going to be doing. Are you just redoing the week 2 project worksheet? So for this, you're not just redoing it because now you're writing it in paragraph form. I mean, I would write it in paragraph form. So no, you're revising your questions. You're explaining why you wrote your questions in that way, not why it's important to you or why it's important to the world, but just you thought your original question was too big. Now you've decided to narrow it, or you thought it was too narrow, and now you've decided to expand it. And then you're just going to say what you learned from your primary sources and what they tell you about the context with the secondary sources. So it's it can be seen as that, but now we're adding in the review questions, the revised questions, and the primary sources. So this actually has 3 components. This assignment has 3 components, which is, what are your revised questions and why did you revise them in that way? What do your secondary sources tell us? So why are they important? And what do we learn about the historical context and trends during the dropping of the bomb according to your secondary sources? So those are the 3 things we want you to work on. What are your revised research questions? What do your primary sources tell you about this, and how do they relate to your secondary sources? And what is the historical context? What is happening in the world during the dropping of the bomb according to your secondary sources? So those are the 3 questions we want you to answer. Does that help? Oh, good. Okay. These are really good questions, guys. I am glad that we are working through this tonight, and I'm really glad you're asking them because I think that's going to help a lot of people when we get to share this in the learning community. And this is also just really good for me to know because selfishly I can now help kind of shape my announcements a little bit better for this week now that I know that this might be a point of confusion. Awesome. And remember, obviously, as always, you can ask me, you can ask your instructor, you can ask the peer tutor in the learning community, you can send a draft to your instructor, a brief outline, ask if he or she thinks you're on the right path. Okay, I see writing. Just waiting for it to come through. We are now halfway through the course. I hope everyone is feeling pretty confident as we continue to go into these skills. I feel like everybody in my classes, they're doing pretty well, keeping up. Yes, yes, I can totally repeat the questions one more time. So 1, what are your revised research questions and why did you revise them that way? 2, what are your primary sources and what do they tell us about this topic and how do they relate to your secondary sources? And 3, what is the historical context? What is happening around the world when the atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima? What, according to your these are according to your secondary sources, what are the important historical trends happening around the world when we drop the bomb on Hiroshima, according to your secondary sources? So 1, what are your revised research questions and why? 2, what are your primary sources? What do they tell you? And how do they add to your secondary sources? And 3, what do your secondary sources tell us about the important historical context and trends happening around the world when we drop the bomb in Hiroshima? How is that? How are we feeling, everyone? I do see a typing. Oh, yeah, Rich. Yeah, yes. So I would just email your instructor and ask them. I assume that the instructor will say yes. I mean, if we don't get the draft until say Sunday, it can be hard for us to get back to you in time. But if you send your instructor a draft by Friday, Friday is usually if you can get me a draft by Friday at 11:59 p.m. when I'm talking to my students, that works. So I would email your instructor and say, if I can get you a draft of this by Friday at 11:59 p.m., would you be able to look this over on Saturday and get me comments back by Sunday for me to revise and fix? Yes. So, yeah, just email your instructor a heads up if that's what you plan to do. And I assume he or she will say perfectly fine. Because again, for us as instructors, it's a lot easier in a way to fix it on the front end than it can be sometimes on the back end. So yeah, I know personally I would rather get a draft. No problem. You are welcome. How is everybody else? Does anybody else have any other questions? We're all feeling better tonight. Do we feel better after all of this? Did I answer the questions? I feel like the internet is not loading everything. All right, well, everyone, I want to thank you for coming out. I appreciate it. You had great questions that I'm pretty sure are going to help everyone in the learning community, and they're also going to help me as I shape my work. Yep, thank you, everyone. This was great. I am going to stop recording, but I'll continue to answer questions for a second or two. Although, nope, it seems like everybody's ready to go to bed. Do not blame you. So I'm going to stop recording.